Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Heather Staines, the Director of Partnerships for Hypothesis, and I'd like to welcome you to our alt facts, fake news, and misinformation lively lunch. We'll be talking a little bit about fact-checking, media literacy strategies in the classroom and beyond. We have 4 speakers today. 2 are here with us in the room, and 2 are joining us remotely. Voila. First, we're going to kick things off. The way that we really kind of hope to do this session today is to give you some sort of brief tastes of the types of projects that our panelists are working on, and then leave plenty of time for you to not only share maybe some of the projects you're working on at your institution or your company with us, and we can have a kind of a true discussion. That's the intention. First, we're going to hear from Lisa Janicki Henchliff. She is professor, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and she does information literacy, library assessment, value of academic libraries, inclusion and mentoring. Second, we have Darcy Gervais. She's the manager of reference at SUNY Purchase University. On the screen, they're no longer on the screen. There we go. We've got John Udall, who is my colleague at Hypothesis. He's the director of implementation. And we've got Mike Caulfield. He's the director of networked and blended learning at the University of Washington. So we're going to go ahead and kick things off with Lisa.
I was wondering how I actually made that all work, so that's great. Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this session here today. So I'm going to kick this off by sort of giving a very big picture, and particularly thinking about the fact that, honestly, the more things change, they don't. There's a few things I think to keep in mind about our particular era of, and our current interest in this area of fake news. So the first one, there we go, is that fake news is not news. And what you've got there actually is an image of a man sitting and reading the newspaper sort of sketched out there. But we know that we've had quite a bit of kinds of information that challenge, honestly, students, but all of us sometimes, to really know what's going on with a particular piece of text or image. We have a history, of course, of great satire. As people have now observed, the Poor Onion, that used to have these headlines that you kind of tell, and now it's less clear. We've had the history of yellow journalism. Of course, we know about propaganda. And in our own field, we have scholarly hoaxes. It doesn't take too long for us to think back to the Sokol affair and, what kind of misinformation was that. And we even have research misconduct. So this whole issue of information that challenges us to really understand what it is, how it's representing itself, and what challenges there might be in understanding it is definitely not a new phenomenon. Nor is the fact that there are an incredible number of psychological and social psychological factors that lead to the fact that fake news, this general category we're using of mis and disinformation, is particularly challenging. Because honestly, heuristically, we go about our lives using a lot of rules of thumb in order to just function in the world. We see information and it has certain characteristics and we take it as it's going to be okay. That's why things like scholarly hoaxes work, right? It looks like a scholarly article, it walks like a scholarly article, we assume it's a scholarly article. Same thing happening with propaganda or other kinds of fake news, misinformation and disinformation. So this particular graphic that you can't really see except to say that if you do a search on whatever Google or the like you want, this cognitive bias codex, this great infographic, will show you all the ways that we're sort of programmed to take in information that we encounter in daily life and sort of accept it as true and accurate, or if not true and accurate, at least reliable enough to go about our lives based on. And so the challenge of information literacy and media literacy combating fake news is really to shut off our natural born heuristics that just have us sort of operate in the world and pause and stop and ask ourselves whether something we're seeing is really what we think that it is. I particularly wanted to share with you this infographic from IFLA that was put out on how to spot fake news. Now, really, it's not just news, and a lot of this looks very familiar to us who have been working in media and information literacy for a long time. But important about this isn't a checklist that, you know, if you get a score of 5 or above, it's okay. It's aspects that we have to think about and make decisions about. This particular infographic, by the way, is available freely as a CC licensed image, and it's also available, I can't remember if it's 24 languages, 36 languages or something, but it's available in multiple languages due to IFLA's nature. I want to also point out that one thing that we have going for us as libraries and librarians right now is that in spite of the fact that there's been a drastic drop-off in trust in experts, in the media, in government, pretty much any group that people used to generally trust has received a great drop-off. Libraries and librarians have maintained their sort of status in our society as a trusted source of information, and that they are trusted by their communities to advise and assist them in this challenging area. So while we are experiencing this challenging time, and while the human brain makes it hard, the one thing we have going for us socially, if you will, civically, if you will, is that the library is still seen as a place that can be relied upon to help you with this issue. Because, for example, the mainstream media has lost that ability to sort of say, you can trust us, because people are saying not. So I think particularly as librarians in the room, we have an important challenge to not just, we need to make good on that trust, but it also means that we are uniquely positioned right now to have the kind of impact that we want to have. So I'm going to turn over to my colleague, who's going to give some sort of more on-the-ground context for this kind of work.
Hello, can everyone hear me okay? All right, so I'm Darcy Gervais, and I am the coordinator of reference at Purchase College, which is one of the State University of New York schools. We're a small liberal arts school, and so the examples that I'm giving are some practical things we've done towards fake news, information literacy instruction on campus. These can be adapted in a wide range of ways, and so I just want to give you a little bit of taste of the practice, since Lisa so eloquently spoke about the theory. Let's see if the green button. All right. So one of the main points that I try to make, particularly with undergraduates, is that it's not just a binary dichotomy of fake versus real news. Fake news exists on a spectrum. Yes, we have partisan bias, but there's also this issue of journalistic complexity, which often gets lost in the shuffle as people point fingers and yell, "You're fake news, no, you're fake news," around this issue. So one tool that I found very helpful in the classroom is this chart, which was developed by Vanessa Otero. It went viral on Twitter shortly around the inauguration, January 2017. Otero is a patent attorney who has an interest in media, but she's not coming from the library world. But she has made this pretty much open source for anybody who wants to use it, and there's various versions of it. This chart nicely illustrates how even mainstream sources, as well as what we might consider fake news or extremely biased sources, such as Breitbart on the right, or on the left, things like Occupy Democrats, they can exist on a spectrum. So not only are they fake or real, misleading, or more legitimate, they also have this y-axis of complex to very sensationalist and clickbait. And so one key point that I try to get across when I'm doing fake news pedagogy is that looking out for sensationalism and things that make you mad, things that make you want to click on it, is a key part of it as well, checking in with the emotional aspects of fake news. I have used this chart very successfully as part of classroom activities. We had a series of teach-ins at Purchase College, tapping into the language of social justice. It was essentially an information literacy workshop, but it was part of a larger event on campus called Days of Action and Dialogue, where across the campus there were various events related to Black Lives Matter, related to activism, social justice. There was also a choir concert because we're an arts campus. So we decided, how can the library be involved? We can have a teach-in. And we taught about fake news. It was well attended. We partnered with 2 faculty from the journalism department. So it was journalism professors and librarians. And we did this activity where we had a blank version of the chart that I just showed you. And we had students, in the case of the young woman in pink. And I later repeated this during a workshop for librarians in New York City. And that's the librarian in the larger image. And essentially, I had little logos of all of the news outlets and asked students to briefly research them to find out more about them, especially since students are not necessarily familiar with sources we might consider mainstream, such as The Economist. People didn't know what that was. So I had them do some research beforehand and then decide where they felt it fit on the chart. We then projected the Otero chart over it and had really lively discussions about why the students chose to put those sources where they did. And in one iteration of this, I actually divided the class into 2 groups and had the students compare each other's charts. So this can lead to a more holistic, interactive conversation about the complexity of journalistic integrity, as well as just fake news. The next thing that I really try to convey in all of my, my fake news instruction is that there is something you can do about it. We spend a lot of time identifying fake news, and as that wonderful IFLA infographic has been circulated, and there are tons of others of that ilk explaining how do you tell something is legitimate, how do you tell it's fake. But we need to do more than that. Our students, especially undergraduates, are very easily turned towards the apathetic. They can get very cynical, especially when they're overwhelmed by the sheer number of fake news sources, and they can tend to say, well, we can't know what's true then, because things could be fake, things could be not, different sides are yelling at each other. We can't know, this is just how the game is, there's nothing we can do about it. How can we fight back against these large media corporations? How can we fight back against Russian propagators of fake news and these mills of clickbait? So we like to try to give them some concrete tasks. And some of these include, don't repost anything without researching. Don't take the bait. Don't click on things. Really do a gut check before. This is part of fighting your own biases. Don't click on something that gives a rise out of you before you do research. You can flag fake posts on social media, which I can talk about more later. There's a number of browser extensions and apps that can help you do that, that I can talk about later after the discussion. And boost the signal of legitimate sources by sharing them more widely, and probably most importantly, support legitimate journalism with your money. Subscribe. All right, and then the last question that I want to raise, this comes up often when I do trainings for librarians about fake news instruction and information literacy instruction. The idea of library neutrality is very ingrained in our profession. And so inevitably, someone always asks me, and I'm going to try to preempt this question today, can you give me neutral examples or apolitical examples of fake news when you use fact-checking? I do a lot of fact-checking activities in class where I'll give students examples of fake news and have them fact-check it. What are some neutral or apolitical examples? And I would push back and say that if we're using apolitical examples, we're not doing our job, because the whole purpose of fake news is to play on our emotions. So if we're using examples that don't make people angry, or at least make them suspicious, we're not giving them an example of what they encounter in the real world. The other problem with this is that non-political examples can perpetuate a false equivalence. So we're familiar with false equivalence from issues around climate change, for example. We know that 99% of the scientific community believes that climate change is man-made and real, and yet often CNN or other news media will have one pundit who's pro-climate change and one pundit who doesn't believe that it's real. So there sets up a false equivalence. Which is kind of represented in my image here. Neutrality seems nice and it seems orderly, like the picture of the books on the shelves, but what happens when the sheer volume of information on one side actually stacks up in a different way, or when you get a lot of fake news and a shorter stack of the truth? How can we shed a light on that as librarians? So those are my points, and I'm looking forward to discussing more with you guys.
We cut to John. John, I hope you can hear me.
I think I'm going next, and John is going
Okay.
after that.
That's fine.
All right. So my name is Mike Caulfield. I'm Director of Blended Network Learning at WSU Vancouver. We run something called the Digital Polarization Initiative, which is a cross-institutional project to teach students the ins and outs of sorting fact from fiction on the web and dealing with the things in between. And I wanted to start today. I'm hoping you're seeing my slides and not just my face talking to you. Is that correct?
We're seeing both.
Seeing both. Okay, great. I'd like to start today with this page here. This is the American Academy of Pediatrics. I'd like to tell a short story that I hope will shock and irritate and maybe enrage you. This is the American Academy of Pediatrics. It's a professional group that has 64,000 members, founded in the 1930s. Their flagship journal, Pediatrics, is considered to be the best journal on pediatrics in the world, and the organization is consulted by governments all over the world when looking at aspects of health of children, right? This is the American College of Pediatricians, which is not coincidentally very closely named to the American Academy of Pediatrics. It is a group that is somewhere between, we don't quite know, but somewhere between maybe 300 and 500 members. It has been branded a anti-LGBT hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. It actually claims that LGBT is a misnomer, that LGBT should be LGBTP because homosexual activism is really ultimately about pedophilia. And I don't really have to go on about that. So what would happen if you took a group of historians who had been steeped in critical thinking for years and years of study, professional historians, students, Stanford students, Stanford undergraduate students, the cream of the crop in terms of the world, in terms of what we think of as ability, in the heart of Silicon Valley. So also the cream of the crop when we think about web literacy. And professional fact checkers at newspapers, right? People that go and do this PolitiFact sort of stuff. And you gave them two articles. One was from the American College of Pediatricians, right? The hate group, and one was from the American Academy of Pediatrics. Now, the solution to this, to figure out, and you asked each group, you asked which of these articles is more reliable? Which of these do you trust to give you anti-bullying information? The answer to this question to anybody that's web literate is quite simple. You would select American College of Pediatricians, right-click, search Google for American College of Pediatricians, and on a quick scan, you'd find it's a socially conservative advocacy group that is been branded an anti-LGBT group by numerous authorities. It has an entire Snopes archive about it. So all these things, should be red flags to you, and they're accessible to you in less than 5 seconds. So we ask this question of fact checkers, professional historians, Stanford undergrads, and we tell them they have 5 minutes and they have the web at their disposal. So go to it. And I want you to think in your mind, what percentage of people are going to say they either can't figure this out, it's just too hard, or say that they actually prefer the hate group over the professional organization. Here's your answer. This is all from a study that was recently done by Sam Weinberg and Sarah McGrew. It's the title of the study is Lateral Reading, Reading Less to something more. I forget now in the moment. But here are the results. The fact checkers find it almost instantly. Their time to complete this task is within seconds. And 100% of them get the answer correct. It's the American Academy of Pediatrics. It's the more trustworthy group. Historians trained in decades of looking at original sources, thinking critically about documents. About 50% of them are able to tell the difference between a professional group and a SPLC rated hate group. And only 20% of students are able to select, again, the more trustworthy source. So this is I tell this story because what I want to do is I want to move our discussion away from these elements of sort of this fuzzy idea of critical thinking and much more to what people can do. And you saw some of that in some of the earlier presentations. I do think that there's this general movement among people who teach media literacy away from these long checklists where we think about documents, where we look at the document and we think deeply about that document, towards what can you do? So if you look at that, IFLA thing that Lisa put up, you'll see that those things are not questions to think about. They're, how do you do a reverse search? How do you Google information about the site? How do you check this group out on Wikipedia, or do those sorts of things? In other words, I think we need, they said lively lunch, so I thought I'd be really irritating and present it this way. We need less critical thinking. We need more network thinking. We need more. We need to give people more instruction on how to use the network, the web they have at their disposal, to quickly verify and construct context for documents that they're looking at. If you want something that's less inflammatory, then we need less critical thinking. Then try this. Make network thinking central to online media literacy. And that's what we're trying to do in the
Mike, we
project.
dropped out of your slides.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if that's on our end here or your end, but
okay.
Maybe you can.
Hold on. Let me
it
see
was
if I
the
can...
less critical thinking, more networked thinking, and then after that it dropped out of slideshow view and we lost you there. So.
All right. And so do you just have me on the screen right now?
Yes.
All right. You know what? And the last slide just says make network thinking central to media literacy. So that's the less inflammatory version of this. We have a text that we're using, a free text. It's called Web Literacy for Student Fact Checkers. It is a somewhat quickly written draft of something we put together over Christmas break initially, and then uploaded to Pressbooks. And again, what we're trying to do really is move the discussion away from some of the fuzzy questions are important, but what most people need when they initially see something online is they need to ground themselves in some sense, some sort of immediate context of what it is they're looking at. After that, they can start to ask relatively intelligent questions. But we want to give students the web skills to quickly build the missing context of the web, so that they can start their questioning from a position of knowledge and not ignorance. And I'm going to hand it over to John now, who thinks a lot about building missing context.
Thanks, Mike. Are we good here? Screen and voice?
Let's see. We can hear you. We're seeing Mike still, and we see no slides.
No slides? Because I am sharing. But if someone else wants to do it, that's fine too.
I don't think we can actually drive it from this end, but I think we saw your slides a little bit ago with annotation in the title.
So how do you want to do this? I mean, I'm sharing from here, but if you're not seeing it, that's not helpful. Are you able to put it up on your end, Heather?
I don't have the slides. I'm sorry.
They're all in the same deck.
That's the previous slides. No, sorry, the deck was converted and passed in a couple days back on this end.
All right, here, let me try this again. Sorry.
It's the wonders of modern technology. Or maybe you're sharing a different browser. Oh, now we have it.
That's good.
Yay.
You got it? Okay. All right. Sorry about that. So, missing context. I'm John Udall. I'm with Hypothesis. It's a tool for annotating the web. Annotation is, as of February of this year, a new web standard. People probably saw this go around recently. It's a nice case of decontextualization. If you're like me, you saw this and thought, of course that boorish president dumped the fish food into the pond. It's exactly the kind of thing he would do. And then it turned out that actually he was following Abe's lead. And this image that we see here was cherry-picked and edited to hide the fact that there was a larger context here. So this is a case where our media environment is removing context. And I was thinking just this morning, actually, about how some of our other media applications automatically provide us with the ability to zoom out and see a wider context, right? So if I zoom in on the location where you folks are now, I kind of take it for granted that I can zoom out and see a wider context. So, you know, we have some kinds of affordances like that on the web, and in other ways, we lack them. Here's a very good example of adding context to the web. So what we're looking at here is an article in The Guardian, and there is a sentence that's been highlighted here, which is a claim made by Dr. Kenneth Kunkel that we're on an upward trend in terms of heavy rainfall events. That sentence has been selected and annotated by Emmanuel Vincent, who is a climate scientist, who is here confirming that that is an accurate statement and is providing additional data and perspective. So, you know, this is a thing that, first of all, as readers of the web, we would all like to have available to us. It would be great if, when I am reading an article about climate change, I can bring a lens of expertise over that content and look over the shoulder or through the spectacles of someone who actually is a qualified expert in that subject. Here's an early version of a tool that Mike and I worked on to support the Digital Polarization Project that he talked about. What's happening here is that the claim that's being evaluated is a sentence in an article in the New Yorker, and that is the highlighted sentence that you see. The student's task here was to analyze that claim, and as part of that, the student is citing the claim in the New Yorker. So the way citation traditionally works in the world today is it's a pointer to a document, right? You would say, you know, it's the New Yorker, and it's this issue of the New Yorker, and maybe you have the URL if the thing is available online, and you point people to the document. But what we're actually doing here is evaluating a specific claim, and that specific claim is the highlighted one that the North Carolina Republican Party actually sent out a press release boasting about how its efforts drove down African-American turnout in this election. So the thesis that Mike and I put forward with this early version of this tool was that it should first be the case that we should teach students, when they make citations, to make citations that refer precisely to target statements in documents, number one. And number two, they should be aware that although actually it's true that a lot of things don't change, one thing has changed in the last year on the web, and that is our ability to do this kind of granular citation. So it's actually possible for the student to place a link into the analysis of this claim that, when clicked, does what we see here, right? It goes to the New Yorker, it brings up the article, it scrolls to the selected target claim, and then brings, in that context, an annotation, which can also be the root of a discussion. So that's an incredibly powerful way to amplify the kind of context around stuff that we read on the web. And you can take it a step further as well. So here, another aspect of this tool is a reimagination of what footnotes might be like. So in this example, when I am clicking on the word boasted, I am following the link that you see there in the tooltip, and that link goes to the New Yorker article, scrolls to the selected claim, and brings up the annotations that relate to that claim. But we can also bring that information directly into the article. So this footnotes section here is actually materializing at the bottom of the same article that the student has written. So that here we have citations that not only point to articles, but that recover the context from those articles and bring it into this context. So I'll just end there with a call to action, which is that I think that this is actually a new kind of thing and is a kind of a digital literacy that we want both available to us as readers of the web and also something we ought to be teaching students as they analyze the web. And that's it for me.
Okay, thanks, John. Thanks, Mike. I'd like to open the floor up to questions and comments. If you have a similar project you've worked on at your institution or you've been thinking about it, it would be wonderful if you can share while you're making that determination. I have a couple of questions that I can start with our panelists. Mike, can you tell us a little bit more about the particular schools that are involved in Digipo and the type of projects they're doing, types of assignments, just so the folks here, if they did want to get involved, how would they go about it, that type of background?
Yeah, so the project itself is run by the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, and if you're one of the 400 member institutions in that, there is a call that just went out for participation. We are looking for 10 institutions right now to roll this out in a bunch of classes and then commit to an assessment of its efficacy. The materials, though, are open to everybody, and we've also provided, as we can, ad hoc support for other institutions trying to do this. So the textbook is open. The ability to post, we have a website, digipo.io, which allows students to publish their own fact-checking articles up there. All that stuff is open to other institutions if they want to use it, and we do try to help them. We've worked with everybody from community colleges to high schools we're talking to Middlebury now. So we have a wide range of students from a wide range of backgrounds, and and what we find is that just everybody, nobody has solve this, unsurprisingly. All these institutions are struggling with this stuff. The more recent change in what we're doing is we have started embedding this not just in a media literacy thing, but it's particularly become attractive to people running things like senior seminars and capstones. Part of the idea of the capstones, that some of the capstones we're doing here on campus, is okay, well, your students have all this disciplinary knowledge and you're going to teach your students to contribute to the scholarly community, teach them to contribute to the popular community as well. And so we have a big SciComm community here, and what the instructors and faculty are doing there is helping those students who are at really the end of their career figure out how to best contribute back to the information environment and make it better. We call it info environmentalism. Trying to improve the information environment and remove pollution.
Thanks. Does anyone have any questions for Mike on the Digipo project? Everyone's still digesting lunch. If you could please come to the microphone. They have headsets, and so they can really only hear if it's on the microphone. So we have just one question coming up. It's a dreary, drizzly day here in Charleston compared to the sunny weather we had earlier in the week. So we're all trying
we can
in
see
denial.
the sun streaming through your windows, so that's hopeful. I just had a question on the accessibility of Digipo and was wondering if somebody's using screen reading software, is all of that accessible to them?
Well, I can say a couple sentences on the actual publication of stuff. We have. Our publication has moved to a straight HTML, a very simple HTML format for reading that accepts any input that can be processed through Google Docs, right? So if you can do it in Word and upload it as a Google Doc, you can put it together and it can be pumped out as both accessible to the reader and accessible to the producer, in the sense that you can use whatever tool it is that fits your needs. And what we find with accessibility is it's not just about tools, it's about people who have accessibility needs being able to use the things that they're familiar with. So we've worked quite hard to try to allow a bunch of tools to filter in to the website. I'll let John talk about the actual annotation tool, which has some similar characteristics.
So the annotation tool, frankly, has some accessibility challenges at this point on the producer side in particular. And that has to do with the fact that the process begins with a selection in a web page. And we've done some significant research on this, and there isn't an easy and obvious way to make the process of making and adjusting a selection in a web page accessible, for example, to screen readers. And I've actually validated that with the accessibility experts that we consult with. So that's a challenge. On the consumption side, it's a whole lot easier. So like Mike said, any format can be processed into an HTML rendering, and that HTML rendering, if it includes what we call hypothesis direct links, which are these links to these contextualized annotations, those will be extracted and placed into the document just as plain HTML. So it plays nicely in that environment on the reading side.
I just want to add one thing about the annotation tool. I mean, the students, generally, we have students work in groups, and if you are looking to do this, you do have accessibility concerns in the class, we don't have all the students do the same work, right? Some of the students do the writing, some of the students dig up articles, some of the students do the editing, and some of the students do annotation. And so you can certainly structure this as an accessible assignment where you're tapping into the different strengths of the different students.
Question?
Yeah. This is for Mike. My name is Bob Boise. I work for Springer Nature, but more importantly, I'm a Middlebury College alumni. I was wondering if the schools that have been amenable to, working on Digipo have cited any particular reasons why they were interested. There was some obvious confrontation on the Middlebury campus not that long ago.
Yeah, so I'm not going to dig too much into our Middlebury conversation. I do know the head of digital, the vice provost for digital learning there is Amy Collier, who is just a brilliant person who I've had the pleasure to know for a long time. So that's really the main reason we started talking to Middlebury. But to your larger point, yeah, a lot of institutions, for a variety of reasons, both political and institutional, are looking for ways to address, what people have kind of glibly referred to as the post-fact world, but also to address some of the polarization issues. And the pressure to do that is not just the faculty want to do something. It's one of these rare instances where all the faculty I talk to want to do something around this, but also the Board of Trustees wants the institution to do something about this. And all the alumni are contacting these institutions and saying, what are you doing about this? So we have a very rare moment where the administration, the faculty, the Board of Trustees, the alumni, all of these stakeholders in the institutions, and especially the students, right, really want to do this. And so it's been the easiest thing I've ever sold to people. It really does sell itself, and the biggest problem we have is just our capacity to support all the institutions that want to participate.
Can you mention a couple of the other institutions, Mike?
Yeah, so the official institutions, like I said, the call is going out for those 10 institutions where we're going to do a really deep look and get some assessment data. So we don't know what those institutions are, but University of Mary Washington has been huge for us, and they have they went really deep into some of these annotation tools that John put together. University of or Western Kentucky University did a wonderful set of climate change activities down there, and again, it built a freshman seminar on it. Our campus is now doing 9 different sections this semester in everything from family diversity for our human development program to a climate science capstone and a neuroscience capstone. This has been great for us. It's also been great because a lot of people in the sciences have found that they really have a place in this in a way that they haven't always seen other digital initiatives, right? So if you think about digital humanities, it's so out there and so in front of a lot of other things. But this is now a way for the science people to come into the fold too.
Okay. I have a question for Lisa. We had a prep meeting for today's Lively Lunch, and kind of to segue from Mike and John talking about the classroom, one of the things you referred to in our planning call were some of the challenges, but it being absolutely critical to transfer this sort of classroom-based activity to the real lives of the students. So maybe you can talk a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Sure. I think one of the things that is often the case is we have to think about, okay, we can set up curriculum and supported learning experiences and sort of scaffold students through a set of learning activities where we can sort of get them to a competency level in a controlled environment, if you will, where someone is saying, check this, do this, but then we walk out of the classroom and we live our lives, and some of those things that have to do with the fact that there's a lot of information coming at us. We have to make a lot of decisions in our life every day. We don't always remember the information that we would be most useful to have. So we typically can't live our lives in the fact-checking mode we were talking about in that curriculum. And so how do you sort of bring some of this perspective of, okay, pause, think, stop, don't share, which Darcy particularly talked about. And I think the particular challenge that we find is how to do this. It's great if you've got a whole class where you can do this over a semester and you can sort of build the muscle memory with the students. But one of the challenges that I see is a lot of people are looking for the quick fix lesson plan that's 40 minutes long. And I'm sort of two minds about it right now, because I am seeing that certainly it can raise awareness, but it can raise awareness to that point that it actually does leave the student in actually that cynical or I'll just never be able to cope with it, so why bother space. And honestly, I think that might be a little bit more dangerous as a learning outcome than if we hadn't addressed it in the first place, which is this is always a challenge for education, is to make sure we get to the point where it actually has the right impact, not the wrong impact. So that's something I'm a little concerned about. One thing I do think that comes out, and I appreciate this whole notion of sort of annotation and the like, is that these processes are also highly social. So when we proposed this panel versus today, we all know a lot more about what happened with Facebook and the way Twitter and other things were being intentionally manipulated to create social psychological factors, not just individual ones. And so we can also think about how does that function on our campuses as students are, say, in those sort of more informal learning environments of their study groups. Can we encourage a certain kind of peer pressure or peer encouragement that isn't about correcting somebody, but maybe at least asking, can we all pause and take a moment here? And also, honestly, I think the other thing this kind of gets a little bit away from the misinformation, but I'm seeing a real decline in the ability to actually talk through difference. And that seems to be the additional challenge that we have here, which is it's one thing to be like, okay, is this credible sources, justifiable, true belief? But if we see something differently, how do we work through that in a community? So I'm starting to see that as the next challenge with this as well. So I don't know, Darcy, are you seeing that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very important, and this is one reason why if you do only have a short amount of time to work with students, having them be the sort of leaders in the process is so important. So I open the teach-ins and other workshops that I've done by giving students usually about 5 fake news articles from across the political spectrum and they're a range. Some are true, but with some sensationalism, so there might be a grain of truth, but it's sensationalized. Some are satire, some are outright crazy, and I just turn them loose. I basically say, okay, find out if these are real or fake. And I start with the binary thinking and then gradually move them towards that spectrum activity that I showed earlier. And one thing that this does is it allows the students to use the skills that they already possess and that they're used to using outside of the classroom towards fact checking. And it's been really interesting to see with groups of students which methods they gravitate towards first. Some students will find Snopes immediately, and then Snopes is good enough for them. Other students question why we should believe Snopes. And we're an arts campus, so I've had students who did sort of in-depth analysis of the photoshopping of a particular image that I used as part of a meme. And they were able to tell just from the way that the image looked to them that it had probably been manipulated without using TinEye or any of these reverse image lookup tools that we discuss later. So I think starting them out by throwing them into the deep end and then having them collectively address all of the points that end up on something like the IFLA infographic is a great way to kind of take what they already know and build upon it. And I do think the cynicism issue is a huge problem. And I think also the issue of not being able to have a dialogue from different sides of an issue. So I try to use carefully chosen examples when I do it. So I use a lot of things from the left because my students are primarily liberal. And they come into the class expecting to see a meme with Donald Trump's face, and I do have one of those. But then they're surprised to find stuff from sources that like Occupy Democrats or Addicting Info that are coming up in their social media feeds. They're surprised to see that those are also on the sort of more fake or clickbaity end of the spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Mike, did you want to chime in on that? Is it something that's part of Digipo, talking about outside the classroom as well as in?
Yeah, so a couple things to work off there. The first is I really want to wholeheartedly agree with the cynicism issue. A lot of people misconceptualize disinformation campaigns as being about persuasion, and disinformation campaigns are not, modern disinformation campaigns at any rate, are not about persuasion. They haven't been actually for quite some time. Modern disinformation campaigns attempt to erode trust in a society to cause a societal and social breakdown, right? That's the point of a modern disinformation campaign, and that's what you see happening, right? So we have to think, when we think that media literacy is the cure for this thing that ails us, we have to understand that the true intent of this is to erode trust in society. And when you erode trust, right? When you take away trust in society and you take away truth, the only thing left is power. And so you're left with you're left with essentially this authoritarian polarization. So it is absolutely true that if you give students a little bit of this, and what I've seen go wrong in a lot of previous media literacy approaches is you show students a flurry of all these things that are absolutely wrong, and you're like, ha, you're smarter than this. Ha, you're smarter than this. Ha, we debunked this. And at the end of it, what they're left with, students economize, right? Students will take the smallest possible lesson from anything you teach them, and it's absolutely frustrating. But they can economize that down to this understanding that is simply you can't trust anything. And if you let them economize that understanding down to that, that's what they will walk away with. And so we actually, we're very focused on this, and part of the way we're focused is we actually do believe, I heard Lisa talk about muscle memory. We're focused on the things that you can do to get yourself to solid ground. That's what we want the students to see this. It's not everything is fake, but look, you're kind of on the sea of uncertainty. Like, how do you find land? How do you find it quickly? How do you do that in 90 seconds when you're scrolling past 300 things on your feed? And that's not, I mean, you have a bunch of librarians there who may tell me completely different, but I have worked with librarians in my capacity as an instructional designer for a long time. And I will say that 10 years ago, that's not the environment we were conceptualizing media literacy as fitting into, like this 100 posts a minute sort of environment where people take 90 seconds to get to something that isn't absolutely false. And so I think what I see from the people that I admire in this space is a reorientation to this new environment, a deeper understanding of the true costs and intents of disinformation in terms of doubt, in terms of social erosion, in really focusing the methods that we give students on being very suited to that environment that we're graduating them into.
So I have a question for John. I think, John, you referred a little bit in passing to the work that Emmanuel Vincent and his group has done around fact-checking in climate change. Could you tell us maybe a little bit more about what the Climate Feedback group is doing, or some of the other journalists that you're in touch with who are using these tools either for public awareness or for their own personal investigations?
Sure. So Climate Feedback are a couple hundred of the most highly qualified climate scientists who have banded together in a coalition to provide this lens of expertise over stories in the mainstream press about climate change. And they not only rate the stories all up, in some cases, it might be a very credible story that appears in the Wall Street Journal. In some cases, it might be a completely ridiculous hoax that appears in I won't name the outlet. And this is something that we all, I think, can see clearly the benefit of, right? That is, if I knew that there were such people and I could bring their expertise over what I'm reading, I would want to do that. Or that is, I would, you would, probably most of the people in the room here would. A bunch of other people wouldn't, right? And, we're not going to solve that problem with a climate feedback model, I don't think. Because, it gets back to this muscle memory and this intuition and awareness, situational awareness, right, of where you sit in the information space. And so without inculcating that instinct to, I really like what Mike said about seeking solid ground. I think that's really the message that I'm going to take away from this conversation. That's ultimately what we need to be teaching people.
Mm-hmm. Sort of jumping off the journalist angle, again, when we had our prep meeting, one of the things that we talked about, Lisa mentioned, the differences between digital literacy and media literacy, and we went back and we reviewed, the description of the session and, the role of journalists in, kind of creating this trust. Is that something that, comes up in instruction and working with faculty? Darcy?
I think so. I mean, I partnered with 2 journalism professors when I developed the teach-in, and so I think they could speak to Mike's earlier point about the fast-changing nature of our media landscape right now. In terms of students or others believing in journalism, I mean, I think it kind of depends which audience we're looking at. If I'm looking at a class of journalism majors, they seem to have a high regard for the journalism profession, but students at large, I'm not sure. I mean, I think this is also an issue of political bias, right? So one of the ways that you can continue to sort of poison and the information landscape and provide more misinformation is to attack the credibility of journalists. I think we do need to do more generally to support journalism. So that's why one of the sort of concrete steps and calls to action that I usually convey to students is to actually subscribe to or use library databases to get to legitimate journalism, especially if it's something you're using a lot. And also a simpler way, if you are using ad blockers, you can disable them on legitimate sites that you visit. So using ad blockers when you investigate claims can take away the financial incentive of these clickbait sites. You can use an ad blocker or a private browser or an incognito browser, and then you can disable that when you're on journalists. But I don't know if I'm answering your larger question, though. Or if I got
Actually,
a little
Heather,
far
can I add
field.
something to that?
Sure,
Yeah.
go ahead.
So one of the things I noticed when Mike and I were kind of putting together this early version of Digipo, I played the role of a student who is tasked with essentially being an investigative reporter. And I went through and researched in great detail a couple of claims. And it was some of the hardest intellectual work I've done in years to actually assemble all of the sources and organize the evidence and think through it and come to some sort of judgment about the claim that was made, right? I think I spent a dozen hours on the North Carolina voter suppression article. And for what it's worth, I think that leading students through that kind of exercise is, if nothing else, perhaps going to give them an appreciation for the value of professional journalism and the difficulty of doing it well. And perhaps, I mean, somebody said earlier, we want students to be subscribing to quality media sources. Maybe if they actually walk a mile in the shoes of journalists who need to do a good job of this kind of thing, they'll be more likely to do that.
Could I add something to that?
Sure, go ahead.
Heather. So there's a famous quote at the beginning of a relatively popular introduction to journalism that defines journalism as a discipline of verification, right? All the other stuff, what distinguishes journalism from opinion pieces, from analysis, and so forth? The meat of journalism is this discipline of verification. And I think students don't know that. Students just have never even conceptualized that that's what journalism does. One of the things that we're showing them is when you read an article, like, where did this information, one of our big things is trace it to the original source, right? And you look at an article that seems like it's original journalism somewhere on Breitbart, but no reporter actually talked to all the people quoted in the article, right? Someone else at some other desk down the line, up the stream, talk to all these people. And going through that and understanding that the journalist is the person that goes through these processes of verification, and that when we talk about what good journalism is, we're actually not talking about where you fit in some as you said, there's a multi-dimensional spectrum for these things, right? And we're not necessarily talking about left or right. We're talking about what is your discipline of verification, how transparent is it, and what are your incentives to adhere to it, right? And if you can look at those things, if you can look at the reputational incentives, and you can look at the transparency of the process, and you can look at the nature of the process and the ability to follow through on that process, whether it's the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, I will trust the Wall Street Journal on a factual issue. I used to write for Daily Kos. I will trust the Wall Street Journal on a factual issue any day of the week over Daily Kos, because the Wall Street Journal, the reporters, right, not the opinion pages, which has gone massively off the rails in the past few months, the reporters follow a discipline of verification that is a respectable pass at how you make sure what you're saying is true. And John is completely right. Once you do this as a student, you start to understand what it is that you're outsourcing to journalists and why we do outsource it to journalists, because someone needs to do this, and because ultimately if you start from nothing, it's very hard work.
I think one thing that's interesting to think about is to juxtapose also, so I think everyone who's in the room listening, talking here, like, we look at a newspaper, and those, like, we can identify this is the opinion piece, this is the reported journalist, and that's actually an interpretive act on our part that happens for us so quickly and so naturally, and certainly something that librarians have been struggling with ever since our very first full-text database came online, because historically we've always taught, look at physical characteristics of things in order to infer the intellectual from it. And when we got those first full-text databases and everything was black and white text, HTML presented, it really flattened out all of our characteristics that we were especially teaching, which was scholarly articles versus popular magazine articles, right? And I think we have that flattening effect in a lot of cases. But I also think it's possible that there are other incentives that have come into media, if you will, that have actually led to intentionally obscuring that these are different kinds or different genres that are being published on the same platform. And so it's not so obvious even to some of us who are educated in this, but it's certainly not obvious to people who, let's also remember that most of us in this room probably had the experience of reading a physical object that we called a newspaper. And so we bring all kinds of cognitive schema to looking at a website, which still by and large relies a lot on what things were called and the way things were organized in a physical world. And the students aren't bringing any of that to that page. And I'm more familiar with the challenge of this with scholarly articles than I am with newspaper sites, honestly. It's very, very difficult for students to interpret all these different genres that show up on one saved platform when all the cognitive schemas that are supposed to be invoked by the UX design of it assume you have experience in the analog world.
It gets even worse. Facebook, of course, in their presentation of news articles, quite famously takes off all the physical characteristics, whether it's typography, layout, and so forth, from the articles that students are seeing pass through in the feeds. So there's almost nothing to go on. And then, as you say, the mix of this, it gets more and more blurry. One thing that we found is that traditional newspapers doing traditional reporting in the text of the article are pushing out clickbait headlines that are completely unsupported into the social platforms, right? So what do you do with something like that? If you have a article from the Independent that is actually a well-reported, verified article that pushes out an unverified headline that scrolls past someone on Twitter or Facebook, like how do you conceptualize that in genre terms? It's a much more blurry world than it would have been 20 years ago.
Yeah, and if I could just speak to that as well. I don't know if we can get the slides back, but I had one slide that might be helpful for this. But I think there is an attempt to add some context back into an online environment through web extensions and other apps or annotation. I think it's somewhat of an arms race. So even in the 6 months or a year that I've been teaching on fake news, there have been more and more of these types of browser extensions that have come up. And they all primarily rely, the good ones, on actual teams of fact checkers. There's one from Slate called This Is Fake. There's one called Check This by Metacert, and there's something called the BS Detector for Chrome and Firefox, and it's by a group called Open Sources that's based on a curated list of unreliable sources that Melissa Zimdars, I think from Merrimack College, made. So these are the attempts to kind of correct this, but it's not going to be enough, and it sort of relies on students voluntarily downloading and knowing about these things and adding them. So they do add some visual context. There'll be a big red flag over a Facebook post, for example, that it comes from a questionable source, and different apps have different degrees of detail that they go into. So some will say why it's flagged, because this is a conspiracy, or because it's satire, or because it's alt-right. And others allow you to report them back. So I think that's sort of a new frontier of the battle against fake news, but it's hard to see given the financial incentives that are so ingrained, and that's the reason why you're seeing clickbaity titles in something like The Independent or other more legitimate sites. I think the burden of overcoming that cannot be met by free browser extension apps.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Okay. It's just a thought, and maybe some comments from anybody on the panel. As a father of a son who's on a student chapter of public interest research group, it strikes me as a very clear ally of this kind of work. If they're going to work in the public interest, they better get their facts straight. And I think those student chapters are actually quite important across the country. And maybe there's a way to amplify the message, or at least make sure that those folks get that kind of training that they need?
That's a great thought. We work with the student pergs on open resources and open education, and they have revolutionized the open education space. I hadn't thought of them as allies in this work, but if they could do what they did for open education, it would be amazing.
Do we have any other questions? Yes, if you could go to the microphone.
I have a question. I think it's for John. The New Yorker piece about the Republicans bragging about suppressing voters. I couldn't quite see where that information led back to. I think you put up something that supported that statement that came from another source or something. Could you explain that?
Yeah, I can tell you more about the process. So, do you remember where the original? I guess that was one that I came up with. I was out, Mike and I were working on this, and we were coming up with some sample claims to sort of run through this process. Mm-hmm. And I read that in the New Yorker, and it was sort of like that that Trump thing that I showed at the beginning, where my first instinct was, of course Trump did that, right? And when I read that statement in the New Yorker by Jeffrey Toobin, I said, of course the Republicans boasted about North Carolina voter suppression in a press release the day before the election. Like, of course they would do that, So I actually went into it with a bias to confirm what I had read there, right? But part of the lesson of Digipo is to defer judgment and spend time up front gathering evidence and compiling and organizing and marshaling and thinking about evidence. So and since this wasn't a topic that I was well informed on, I used hypothesis to gather information from dozens of sources, including I went back to the I went back to the Voting Rights Act, right, and I went back to the more recent gutting of aspects of the Voting Rights Act, and I went through a bunch of things that had been written about the shenanigans that went on in the 18 months leading up to the election, mm-hmm. And I spent a long time doing that, just gathering evidence before I even attempted to synthesize, a judgment. And the judgment that I came to surprised me, which was that I actually thought Jeffrey Toobin had overstated the case, right? And that I didn't rate the claim as true. I didn't rate it as false. I think I rated it as mixed. It was more nuanced than I had initially thought. Right, but I only got to that point after a long process of gathering related evidence and compiling it. And the benefits here, first of all, like I said, for a student, I think, is that you have a much deeper appreciation of how hard it is to actually get to the bottom of anything. Right, number one. Number two, having used this tool myself, I created a breadcrumb trail for anyone else to follow. So all of the raw evidence that went into my assessment of that claim is available and is linked to that article. And that is actually, first of all, a literacy that I think that we ought to teach and expect students to understand. But even before that, I mean, that should actually be a professional practice, right? Newspapers don't, in general, compile and make available the source materials for their work. They barely even link to things, right? And I think that we should, Dan Whaley, the founder of Hypothesis, when he looked at this, he said, I think you've actually gone through a process here that's way deeper than what a typical investigative journalist would do. And I think that might have been true in that case, and that we should set that expectation, both of students, but also of journalists.
Okay.
There's also a neat point there about the Digipo process, which is that a lot of people see getting caught in my earphones here. A lot of people see this sort of like, is it deep analysis and questioning of media, media literacy, truth to power, that whole thing, or is it like these quick, like, let's get to dry land in 90 seconds? And it turns out that it's both. That the way you actually do what John did turns out to be a bunch of these 90-second excursions to figure out, oh, well, is this what I should be using? Is this what I should be using? And those you start to pull those together. It's kind of like making a nest. You find the suitable, not that I've made a nest, but it's you find suitable material for constructing this thing. But the sort of basic step of that is what constitutes suitable material for pulling this together, right? How do I know when I've hit dry land? So if you look at John's article, there's this complex argument made about whether this was sort of generic, like let's screw our opponents sort of voter suppression, or if it was racialized voter suppression. And that's a very complex argument that requires a sort of depth of nuance. But the little moves that you do to find the materials to create that are all these relatively, is this a reliable source or not? Does this constitute evidence or not? Sort of moves. And so these things work in concert. And I do think that this notion of dry land is kind of, in what constitutes actual evidence, is kind of the building block of the larger, more complex, more nuanced, critical process.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Carol Doyle, and I'm at Northwestern University.
Thanks, Carol. We're getting towards the end of time, so I want to make sure we have the opportunity to thank our panelists and our tech team for bringing our remote panelists to us with such flair. So thank you all.